What's up, you guys? I'm Benjamin.
I'm Miranda, and welcome back to the Marriage is Ministry podcast.
If you're new here or not new here, this channel exists to encourage you guys with the truth of God's word through the lens of our marriage. In the short time that we've been married, we've seen many highs, many lows, and many in-betweens. And our hope is that we're able to encourage you guys in whatever season you're in.
In this episode, we're going to be talking about ministry inside our home, ministry at church, and just how we balance that as a family, as we both are involved in ministry in different capacities.
Yes. So around when Miranda and I first started dating, I was already involved in full-time ministry. And around that point, I had already been in ministry for about 8 years, something along those lines. Mm-hmm. And I've been incredibly blessed and grateful for the opportunity to have led worship amongst many churches, not only in California, but across the country, and even some cases around the world. There were a lot of presuppositions that I know I had about ministry kind of going into our dating relationship. And I guess you would say even you did as well. Mm-hmm. Of course, as we got engaged, as we eventually got married, and in our case now have a kid, our perspective on ministry has changed significantly, where I would say a lot of those presuppositions that we built up in our heads have been broken down and replaced and rebuilt with something much stronger. With that came a lot of growing pains, a lot of conversations, a lot of things that we had to figure out together in real time. And I think there is a need for this particular conversation because we don't really always talk about it. It's something that is talked about, certainly in premarital counseling. Mm-hmm. Marriage is the first ministry. There are needs in church, but the ministry that comes first and foremost in any married relationship is going to be the home.
I agree. And something I learned, oh, hi Mia. Here's our cat, Mia. Ministry when you're single is way different than ministry when you get married. And I think that's one of the big learning curves we had coming into marriage. Because we were both so heavily involved before we got married, it was definitely a shift once we did get married. And so, like he was saying, in our premarital counseling, they told us, marriage is always going to be your first ministry. And once that's taken care of, then you're able, to pour out into others. And so I remember before I met him, I was serving in young adults ministry. I was a leader. So I'd been serving for 5 years at that point.
Yeah,
when I met him. Yeah. And so, when you're single, you can go to every event, be so involved, and do all the things, right, when you're single, and it just makes it a little bit easier in that sense, because you're only really having to think about yourself and those that you're serving at church. And I remember my pastor at the time told us, really soak up this time of ministry when you're single. Look at it as a blessing. So if you're in a season where you're single, it truly is a time where you can really be used for God, because it's just you that you have to worry about at that time, and you can really just put all your effort and energy into serving God, and so I'd say if you are in a single season, to look at that as a blessing, because you are able to do all the things and to maybe reach more people because you have the time and capacity. That season of serving and ministry was a really fruitful time, but I'd say, shifting into marriage, it was, okay, now I got to take care of this first, our relationship, which is a beautiful thing, and then marriage is also a gift from God, and then also, okay, how does that look to balance married life and serving now? And so it definitely does shift and change once you get married, and we can kind of talk about what that experience was like for us.
Yeah, I think with any new relationship, it will naturally come with its growing pains. That's just kind of what happens when you are two different people trying to learn to work together. Mm-hmm. In our case, I think the huge shift, in a good way, but it did bring a lot of growing pains, was when we got married. Mm-hmm. Because though we were engaged and perspective was slightly shifting towards getting married, among other things, we still very much so lived lives apart from each other, because obviously we didn't live together yet. And we still lived in different cities. Mm-hmm. And in some ways we're involved in different churches. Like, we kind of divided our time between a church in Riverside and a church in Los Angeles. And there were some instances where she would come with me to Los Angeles. Other instances I would go with her to Riverside, and other instances that we wouldn't even be together.
Yeah.
And the reason why is I'm grateful to say that ministry is my job. And with that, the responsibility of leading worship has opened doors for me to lead worship at a multitude of churches amongst various cities. And at this time, this was around COVID, not many churches were open.
Yeah.
So naturally, there was a need for people to kind of rise up and be available for worship in just about any capacity. Because interestingly enough, there was a scarcity of that around this time. I think it's interesting how the Lord was so faithful to allow certain doors to be cracked open, only for them to be swung wide open later on. I remember the church that we got involved with in Los Angeles, which is where I eventually took on my first full-time ministry job, and we declared our first home church, which actually that's a whole other story. But
yeah, we're gonna have to stay on task.
We'll unpack that one a little bit. That actually spawned from just a courtesy passing message to a friend of mine who I was referred to for a wedding. So I was in a wedding gig. The person who I was in communication with for the wedding happened to be the worship pastor at this church in Los Angeles. And as I was leaving the wedding, because I think I had a worship night like right after the wedding, I told him, hey, if you ever need someone to lead worship at your church or play keys, whatever the case may be, I'm always available for that. I'm happy to serve and, help where I can. And this was months before the entire country shut down because of the pandemic. During that time, I actually reached back out to him and just wanted to check in, make sure he was okay, his family was healthy, the church themselves was healthy, given everything that was going on. And then I just kind of reiterated, if you need somebody, let me know. I am available and I'm willing to go all the way out to Los Angeles and serve. I was living in Beaumont at the time, which is not too far from Moreno Valley, Redlands, if you're familiar with the Inland Empire. So it was quite a trek. He ended up taking me up on the offer, and my first time serving at this particular church was on Father's Day back in 2020. Needless to say, the rest was history after that. We made ourselves much more available progressively over time. And the reason why I said it's a whole story about how we got involved at this church, I think as it relates to balancing home ministry and church ministry, if I'm being honest, this was a decision that I made more unilaterally. I think it spawned a lot from my ignorance of what it meant to be the leader, what it meant to be the headship. I had for lack of a better word, gross misconception about what that actually meant. Around this time, we were just newly engaged. I think we're about 3 to 4 months into being engaged at this point while trying to navigate a pandemic. There were a lot of things that I had to unlearn at that time. And in some cases, I didn't really unlearn until maybe a year or two into our marriage, where I was often very emotionally led. I allowed the excitement of this dream of mine of wanting to work full-time in Los Angeles doing music, in this case ministry, which is two things I'm incredibly passionate about, to cause me to make a unilateral decision for my family. Looking back now, I realize I could have done a much better job with that. And I think it's a worthwhile conversation to have, because there were a lot of growing pains that I think were inevitable with that season. For all intents and purposes, it was a beautiful season. In many ways, we still love that church. We're still connected to that church and some of the people there. But it was clear that the Lord had not called us there long term. But he was still faithful for us to stand firm in those decisions and to grant us provision and blessing for the time that we were there. So coming out of that, it was a hard-learned lesson for me to really take a step back and consider what it meant to actually prioritize our home ministry. And in that process, I really learned to appreciate making these decisions together and really making sure that we're both in agreement about whatever it is it's going to be. Not only home church, but any opportunity that I might be a part of because of the fact that I do worship ministry. I'm often not home. It's kind of like my tour life and gig life, especially during the summer, where I'm at various churches across the Inland Empire. And in this season of life where the Lord has really challenged me to slow down, not only because my wife needs me, but I actually want to be here, with my son and with her, and to kind of live a little bit more simply, he's really challenged me to consider what it means to slow down and to truly be led by the Spirit. And then on a practical level, making sure that we're both in agreement. In fact, if we're not both in agreement about a particular opportunity, regardless of where it is and any details regarding it, we simply do not take it on. I do not accept it, because I'd much rather reconcile that it won't be the last opportunity and that this is kept healthy, rather than take it on because of X, Y, and Z reason. And even though maybe the marriage bed isn't tainted right in that moment, it becomes a habit that just builds on itself. And then before you know it, it's a house of cards that comes tumbling down in one swift moment. So it's been a learning process from that time in Los Angeles to now. And I mean, now that I think about it, it's been 2 years of trying to figure out what that looks like. And I think we've kind of landed in a really good place.
Yeah. Just to kind of talk about what I was going through at that time. First of all, my husband's very hard on himself. We were both, well, I want to say young when we got married. Not too young, but, we're newlyweds, and, you're bound to make decisions early on that maybe aren't the best, right? Looking back, I also know I was horrible at decision making. I still am, but I've gotten better. But, I really just, kind of left it to him, but not in the sense of, in my head I was saying because he's the leader, but I wasn't, intentionally praying as I should have been for him, praying myself, and helping to make those decisions. And at the time, I was more focused on, the financial, yeah, this is a good job, take it, Because at the time, we both were just starting our jobs and, we were about to get married. And so I was like, yeah, it just makes sense, And so, I think we both were just young in our decision making. But I still see, I wouldn't say it was necessarily the wrong decision. I think the Lord still used it to grow us both in a lot of ways. And it did come with a lot of hardship. But, that's what the Bible tells us. So there's a verse that comes to mind. It's 1 Peter 1:7. I wanted to look it up. But it says, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes through it, is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise. And so that just reminded me that even though that season was really hard, we were being tested, by fire so that our faith could be more pure and could grow and be something beautiful. So I think our marriage and our faith individually has grown so much because of that season. Everybody can look back on their life and see these choices they've made, and yeah, maybe they weren't the right choices, maybe they just weren't at the right time, or maybe we may go ahead of God sometimes, but in the end, God still uses it to help us grow and to learn. And so I think that's the beautiful thing that came out of that season. And it was a great time of ministry. I was doing children's ministry at the time at that church in LA once we were married and living out that direction. And now, like he was saying, I think we have landed in a really good place. We were kind of at a church in Oceanside after LA, and that kind of was just a season of, I think the Lord was slowing us down then too. Even though that church was far, it was a really simple, small church, one service. Just the pressure was kind of alleviated. I stepped back from serving for quite a while. Was I already pregnant when we went out there? No, okay. I just took a step back because, again, we were so go with ministry in LA because I was working full-time, he was working full-time, then we're both serving at the church. Sundays were a whole day event at that church because it was, at one point it was 3 services and an evening service. Yeah,
so we were basically there all day long. So wake up at 4:30 in the morning to get to sound check sound check starts at 6:30, call time 6. We get there by 5:30 to get things prepared. And then we basically take the whole day to be in Los Angeles, and we don't leave until 9 or 10 p.m.
Yeah.
Get home around 10:30, 11, and then we both have work the next day.
Start the work week, yeah. So that season of life was busy. So our church in Oceanside was primarily an older demographic, which kind of allowed us to slow down again and not feel so much pressure, but also it was a great opportunity just to see a different side of ministry and learn from people who were in a different season of life than us. That was also just a fruitful season, being able to heal from some hurt we had from our time at our old church and just decisions we had made during that time. And we were just coming out of a lot during that time, including our miscarriage. And even though that church was far and it came with its own set of sacrifices as far as driving and all of that, it did allow us to slow down and just be poured into a little bit. And so at that time, I took a step back from ministry, and I really just wanted to focus on our marriage because that first year of our marriage, we really didn't have time together. We had maybe a couple hours in the evenings, if that.
If we
But
were lucky.
our schedules were so opposite because I was a teacher at the time, and so I'm up early, so I want to go to bed earlier, whereas he started later than I did and was out later, and so it was just all over the place. And then again, Sundays were taken up, so really we only had Saturdays together.
If we were lucky.
Yeah, but life. Then you have family events and all these things. So after that, I was like, you know what? I think I need to take a step back so that we could just focus on this. Obviously he was still serving, but it was only one service, so we would really use that time out in Oceanside to, just be more intentional with our time. And so that was a sweet, like, transitional period until we ended up landing at our current home church.
I think it's worth noting, first and foremost, no church is perfect. Mm-hmm. That was something that the Lord very quickly broke down in us, was this high standard and expectation that was just simply unrealistic. Yeah. I think it's because we really look up to our elders, we look up to our leaders, and sometimes if we're not careful, speaking on a macro scale, we can tend to put those people on a pedestal, deify them, if you want to use that language. In a moment when they actually let you down and their humanness comes out, you're almost left dumbfounded, like, wait, what just happened? And we are met with the reality that, these people are just as human as I am. But when you lump it in with that perspective that you have of this person or that ministry or that church, then your perception of that church can crumble so fast. Mm-hmm. That person can crumble so fast. And it's simply not a fair or realistic expectation to live by or to hold anybody to, because nobody can fulfill that standard. That was something that we had to learn the hard way. It wasn't always easy. And again, it's not to say it didn't have its beautiful moments. There were a lot of moments at our old church in Los Angeles that we still hold near and dear to our hearts. Like moments that you can't buy, moments that you can't fabricate or redo. One of my favorite moments or memories from our time in Los Angeles is my old admin pastor. He was my boss, essentially. We would often take lunch breaks almost every single day together and try different coffee shops around Los Angeles. But really, it was just an excuse for us to get out away from the noise and away from the craziness and just be able to connect. Mm-hmm. And for the first time, at least in the context of being a full-time minister, I was able to be mentored and poured into by somebody who had much more experience, who was involved in the exact industry that I desired to be involved in. And he just had nuggets of wisdom that I hold on to this day, that we've taken into our marriage. And even to this day, they're still involved in our lives. We're still involved in theirs. We try to see them when we can and when schedules allow. So there's no doubt that there were beautiful moments in our time there. But there was also no doubt that was a huge presupposition that we had built up in our minds leading up to our time at that church that the Lord broke down. I think it's fair to consider that it was nobody's fault. It wasn't the people's fault at this church. But in any case, though, we just learned to start really looking inwardly and considering, okay, well, we can be critical of this person and that person or this ministry, this circumstance, X, Y, and Z. But am I looking at myself? Mm-hmm. Think of the speck in the log. I can criticize everyone with specks in their eyes, but I have a log in mine. What am I missing in my life that maybe I need to reconsider? I need to lay at the feet of Jesus and allow him to reshape my perspective on. I don't know where it came from for me, but I know that I held leaders and elders to such a high standard to where, in my mind, they almost weren't allowed to fail. So when they did fail, it was like the sky was falling down. And unfortunately, because I was so emotionally led at that time, I allowed that to taint my perspective of certain people. And, I'm grateful to say that I was able to reconcile with those people, approach them behind closed doors and just confess to them, this is what I've been feeling and it's not fair to you. And that's when the Lord really opened my eyes and began to show me what happens when you deify people. You put a God standard on this person that that a person cannot fulfill. Yeah. Only God can. So That lumped in with not knowing how to say no, and I'm saying this as somebody that makes his bread and butter by doing music and doing ministry. In my line of work, if you don't work, you don't eat. Unfortunately, I don't get paid time off and things of that nature. So because of my ambition and because of my fear of not knowing where money was going to come from, I said yes to literally every gig. It didn't matter how far it was. It didn't matter how much or little it paid. If it paid me something, I would do it. Trying to do that while working full-time in Los Angeles at a church that is more evangelist-led was incredibly difficult. Not to mention we had just gotten married and we're trying to establish our marriage bed, which is the main thing that I wanted to say. Do not rush in building your marriage. That was something that we look back in our first year and I really wish that we took more time in. I know that's something we've talked about a lot. By God's faithfulness, we were able to build after the fact and rebuild and be built up properly. But looking back, I know that our outlook on ministry and how things may have played out would have been different, at the very least more amicable, if we had taken more time to establish our marriage. Because in my mind, oh, it's a week, honeymoon, and that's good enough, and then, I need to go back to work because if I don't work, I don't eat. Again, just this false mentality, and more importantly, lies from the enemy, that I need to be busy and I need to do X, Y, and Z, otherwise we're not going to be able to survive. Again, the Lord really challenged those notions in the fact that our marriage wasn't broken, but it certainly was suffering. And it's because we had allowed church ministry to take precedence over our home ministry. That's when we had to come to the realization, okay, Lord, are you calling us to move to Los Angeles? Because for context, we were living 30 miles outside of the city. We were living in West Covina. And anything towards Los Angeles, regardless of how far, if it's not Los Angeles, you're going to be in traffic and you're going to be there for a long time. But we had to ask the honest questions, like, Lord, are you calling us out of this church or are you calling us to move to Los Angeles? And for the first time, we had to make a mutual decision together and realize, I don't think the Lord's calling us to Los Angeles. And we were terrified because that meant I was going to have to leave my job and we would basically be on a single income living in LA County with, if I'm being honest, no alternative in mind. So if there's a nugget of wisdom that I can give you guys today, do not leave your previous job or your current job until you have a new one lined up. And honestly, I kind of always lived my life this way. I always just trusted the Lord was going to provide. Literally a week before I left my old job in Los Angeles, I got another job at a shoe store, literally lined up waiting for me. I told him, this is when I'm done with this job. I can literally start that next week. But in any case, I think the biggest thing, just to circle back to what you said, it really taught me to slow down. I literally had no choice. For one, because we financially couldn't afford much at that time. Inflation was slowly but surely beginning to go up. And two, I already knew that I had to slow down on account of ministry burnout, and that if I were to ever get back into full-time ministry again, I need to be faithful in the here and now for what was 2 years, or actually, sorry, a year and a half of really slowing down to unlearn bad habits and relearn good habits. In that process, we were exposed to a completely different church culture in Oceanside where they were huge on community and we were transparent up front. We initially weren't even doing every single Sunday. We were only doing 1 to 2 because I was telling them I'm burnt out from having done ministry in Los Angeles and not having a chance to establish any foundation for our marriage. And on top of that, we're recovering from a miscarriage. And on top of that, I was getting sober from antidepressants. And on top of that, I was not healthy all around. So there was
Lord had to heal a lot of things to that season.
There was a litany of things that we had to work on, that I had to work on. And I'm grateful to say that even though it hasn't been the easiest 2 years from that point to now, we're on the other side of it, seeing all of that hard work pay off, to where there were many days that I would do certain things, such as go to the gym or seek out certain opportunities, faithfully work at the shoe store with seemingly no end in sight of any relief or confirmation of anything. And yet the Lord was still pressing on me, just be faithful, just keep persevering. And it's like, well, Lord, where am I going to go? I don't know what to do. And he said, I'll show you. And it's like, okay, when? I'll show you. That's all he told me. He was not wrong at all. He showed us that we needed to be in Oceanside. In fact, we thought we were going to plant ourselves there. And then we got pregnant.
Yeah.
That's kind of what stopped that, because of just the challenges of moving while being pregnant was already one thing, much less over 100 miles away from family, away from friends, and basically having to start over. Though we love the church and we still, again, love those people and still have relationships with those people, it just didn't seem like that's what the Lord wanted us to do. Neither of us felt settled about that.
Yeah.
And then there were 2 churches in Idaho, and again, kind of a similar vein. Like, okay, Lord, we see the opportunity here. We can see how you would bless this and why you would want us to be here. But we don't feel any strong sense of confirmation from you that this is where you want us to be. It wasn't until our current pastor, longtime friend of mine from our old church in Riverside, reached out to me on a whim. He actually left a comment on one of my Facebook posts. We just announced the gender of our baby. He left a comment saying, "Congratulations, let's catch up over coffee," which, mind you, I haven't seen or heard from him in years. We just kept in contact through social media. And I thought, why not? I have a lot more time on my hands right now. Let's do it. And even in that conversation, I wasn't thinking of going back to Beaumont because that's where the church is now. And ironically, that's where the Lord has brought us. But in that process, he really did show us what it meant and what it looked like in real time to be led by the Spirit and to make these decisions together. It came with a lot of conversations, ironing out logistics and being very practical about it, but then also interceding for each other. Like, I wanted to make sure that it was a church that she would grow in. She wanted to make sure it's a church that I would thrive in as it related to ministry, and just making sure that if I were to step back into full-time ministry the way that I have, that it would be with a much better perspective. It would be with a much healthier foundation. And by God's grace, it is.
Yeah.
I mean, we feel right at home as a result of that faithfulness.
Yeah, definitely. I agree that we learned how to make those decisions together. I think for a while I was not scared, but just hesitant to voice, like, my desires, I guess, for us, because I was worried it was coming from a selfish place. Like, I was like, I don't want to live in LA, but I wanted to make sure I prayed about that, and it wasn't just because I don't want it, but because the Lord wasn't calling us there. And so when we made the decision to leave LA, that was a year-long, discussion.
Yeah.
Just to put it into context. Like, it wasn't, oh yeah, we just prayed for a week, and then, you know what I mean? It took a year of us praying and really coming to that decision together. And I think from that point on, I just realized, the Lord makes it really clear when you need to move, when not to move. I think we just have to be slow to speak and quick to listen. That's what he taught me in that season, because that year of us praying about it just felt uncomfortable, because I was like, we just need to make a decision. He was going through just so much, and I didn't want to see him hurting anymore. And I knew our marriage was kind of, again, not broken, but we just weren't where we needed to be. But God was just like, just be patient, just wait. And, he eventually revealed to us where we needed to go. And so super thankful for where we're at now, especially now that we have our son, because ministry now with marriage and a child is so different, especially for me, because I was still serving, obviously, when we were married, in children's ministry and in supporting him, because I'm basically consider myself a pastor's wife, but because, I'm representing him as well when we're at church. And so I take that very seriously as his wife, that I'm representing him and our household while we're at church, So I try to be intentional with making sure I'm, interacting with others and serving others at our church, and, representing Christ well for my family. And so right now in this season, with having our son, ministry shifted a lot for me to where it has been mostly about our home and taking care of our home, and reminding myself that is a ministry in itself. And I just want to encourage any moms in that season that, it's hard when you feel like, yeah, but I'm not serving at church maybe, or I'm not doing this and that ministry or this event. And it's really hard at first. It's a hard transition from being able to do a lot of things to doing nothing. for a season. I know I felt like, man, I'm not contributing anything to church, and I realized that I had put more identity in that than I thought, and my value in like what I can do for our church instead of me just being me and serving my husband and my son, you know. And so God's really shown me in this season that that is a ministry, you know, making sure that my husband is supported so he can do what God's called him to do is important, as well as, you know, putting my son's need before ministry now as well. You know, our children are a part of that, and, you know, sometimes my son is teething or he didn't have a good night's sleep, and, you know, sometimes I have to stay home with him. And I think that that's important, you know, not forcing him to go to church because I want to be there if he's going to, you know, be suffering in the midst of that, you know. And so I think as wives, we have to also re-examine, you know, what it looks like to do ministry. And, you know, I still serve in children's once a month, and right now that's what I can do. And luckily it's in my son's class, so I can be there with him, and it's enabled him to get comfortable with the class. And now he's been going to it 2 weeks in a row by himself. And you know, now I am starting to be able to sit into service, and I know that eventually I will be able to serve in more areas at our church. I think God's finally brought me to a place of just accepting that, not just accepting, but really valuing the ministry that I do have, which is our home, because I've seen just how fruitful this season has been for my husband. And, you know, I think me supporting him has allowed him to have a wider reach and just more depth, I think, like in your abilities and in your ministry, because you don't have to worry as much about what's going on here at home. You know, I've been able to take care of a lot of things and make sure our son's well taken care of and all of those things, which of course he's also a part of, but that's my main calling right now. And I'm grateful that God has brought me to a place where I'm starting to really value and appreciate it and not put my worth in what I do at our church, because luckily we have a pastor that is very supportive of the mothers there, and he always just encourages me that, you know, what we're doing is valuable, and he loves the children at our church. Our church has a lot of kids, a lot of little ones, which is a blessing. And yeah, it's just been a great season of, again, just learning what ministry looks like in this season. And, you know, at our church right now, I serve in a small capacity. I've also been, you know, able to have more time at home to do, I bake sourdough now, and I've been able to bless people that way. You know, we've just been talking about like, okay, how can I even use that more for God's glory, right? What can I do to really make that an opportunity to serve? So, you know, God's just really been showing me in this season, you know, that ministry just isn't in a box, right? It's not just one thing, and he's given us all different gifts and abilities, and he just calls us to use it and be faithful with it in the circle that he has us in, right? And your circle could be this small, like mine right now, where I don't get out much. I see my family and our church family and maybe a few other people in between that. But that's the sphere of influence that God's given me right now, and I'm just reminding myself that I need to be faithful even in that small sphere of influence I have right now, you know, and just not getting stuck in comparison either with your spouse as well as with others in your life, because everyone's in a different season. And, you know, my husband's been given different abilities, and I know early on in our marriage I struggled with, like, he's so extroverted, like, I need to talk to as many people as he does, and I need to say yes to as many things as he does. And you know, thankfully now I've realized, no, God's given him those gifts, and I have my own personality that he uses for his glory as well, which I just do better with, you know, one-on-one, with just small intimate groups, little bits at a time. And so, you know, we've been able to just see how, you know, God uses our differences to reach different people. And that's the beautiful thing about marriage, you know, is we get to do that together, and it was part of our vows that we would do ministry, and I'm happy to say we are still doing it 5 years later now, into our relationship, and I wouldn't trade it for the world. Doing ministry is so rewarding. It's been come with its difficulties, but again, we're dealing with humans, and us ourselves are humans. We're gonna fail, people are gonna fail us, but God never fails, and he's been faithful to show up in each and every season that we've been in so far, and I know he will continue to do so.
Amen. I think something that really resonated and confirmed in this season of life with the church that we now go to, the church we call home, is that both the pastor and leaders and the congregation were incredibly sensitive to us coming in, knowing that we were coming from burnout and recovering from that, knowing that we were expecting a baby and preparing for that, and understanding that there were needs that needed to be filled. And there was never, and even to this day, ever any pressure for Miranda to step into ministry, though there are needs at the church. There was never any pressure on my part to feel like I have to do every single service. That has always been an open door from not only the pastor, but the entire leadership, just to make sure that we are healthy, that the wellness of our household is maintained. And outside of just ministry needs, they have been very good and supportive and encouraging to us, just to make sure that they check in. You know, outside of any conversation regarding ministry, they just want to make sure that we're healthy. And that's something that's really been an encouragement to us and has really affirmed the need to prioritize our home ministry. Just going back to something that Miranda said at the very beginning, it starts here, at home. Everything that happens at church, out and about, coming into contact with friends, family, anyone and anything, is an outpouring of the wellness of our ministry here. That if this isn't healthy, then while the Lord can use us in moments, it's not to say that he will necessarily bless those efforts the way that he would if we did prioritize this. In fact, you know, Brandon and Brittany Lake once said this on an Instagram Live years ago. Church, we need you guys, but we also need you guys healthy. Like, we need you guys healthy, solid, strong, unified before we put you into ministry, because anybody who's been involved in ministry knows it takes a lot. It's not just meeting a practical need. There is a deeper spiritual tie to it that does require a lot of you. And when you do that consistently, you do that as a job, more importantly as a calling, it takes a lot out of you, mentally, emotionally, physically even, and of course spiritually. And one of the ways that the Lord has really filled us up to make sure that we're capable of bolstering the load at our church is by making sure that this is healthy. And we've really come to appreciate what it means to make sure that our home ministry is not only healthy, but it's also flourishing. Because now anything that we say and do, especially for our church and with our church, truly has been God blessed. Like, God's hand has really just been over it this entire time. It certainly hasn't been nearly as exhausting or burdensome, if you will, as it used to be, because that perspective is completely changed. And on top of that, the foundation of our marriage is a lot stronger. Like, we had an opportunity over the past 2 years to really cultivate a healthy marriage and understanding what that looks like in our day-to-day. Especially understanding now that, you know, we have a son, she's a full-time mom, and I'm the only one working. You know, it really compels me to consider, okay, Spirit, what is it that you want me to do? Because I can just say yes to whatever the case may be for the sake of meeting a practical need, making sure that our finances are in order. But at the same time, if I'm not stewarding well that which you have called me to, then we can't possibly move forward in a manner that you would bless, that you would desire for us. And I think this is something that I wanted to say earlier. Even though we made many mistakes early on in our marriage as far as decision making goes, it still showed God's faithfulness. Because despite certain decisions that I made from a more emotionally charged perspective, or decisions that she made from not communicating certain expectations, the Lord was still faithful to not only provide for us, but to sustain us through the consequences that came with those decisions. And again, it's not to say that it was entirely bad or in some cases entirely wrong, but at the same time, it wasn't done in full obedience. It wasn't done truly leaning on his understanding and not just our own. And not being led by fear, but being led by faith. And that was something that we learned in this 2-year process where we have now landed at our home church, that we have confidence in the decisions that we make now because we are truly being led by the Spirit and we're coming into agreement together. And we're not feeling bad for saying no, because if you say no because the Spirit has indicated it, your yes will be so much more valuable. Because what you do say yes to, the Spirit not only confirms, your spouse then comes into agreement with, and now you can full send it with full zeal and gusto. And the Lord will breathe on that, and the Lord will bless that effort. You know, it's a very intimate church that we're at now. It's not anything like the churches we've been involved with. And if I'm being honest, I really love it that way. Yeah. Like, there's nothing wrong with the mega church structure. I think it's a model, not the model. And I think there is a place for it to be able to preach to the masses and to evangelize to a crowd of many. But in this season of life, we really desire as a family a more intimate, community-driven church that focuses primarily on a tangible level on relationship. And literally God breathed on this opportunity, not just for the sake of practical needs for our family, but deeper spiritual needs for our family that we've been yearning for and praying for a very long time. And when we chose to prioritize that, knowing that He will provide elsewhere on the practical, He's really allowed this time at our church now to be a beautiful, beautiful season. I mean, it's been a year when you really think about it.
Crazy.
And I look back on where we were a year ago to now, and it's a completely different ministry for the glory of the Lord. And I was actually joking with my band because we were all kind of green working together and serving together a year ago. And we looked at each other today and we're like, man, we really come a long way, y'all. Like, you know, we come a long way from not having Click to now having Click and, you know, X, Y, and Z. But I think the reason why is we had an opportunity to really build the worship ministry in this case with, and I've been saying this a lot, a reverence of the Lord. That worship isn't just a genre. In fact, it isn't a genre. It isn't just a style. It isn't something that's just trendy. It is an attitude, something from the inside out that indicates you deeply respect and revere Christ for who He is. And we get to translate that reverence through song, through praise. And with that as the mission of the worship ministry, the Lord has really breathed on it that as small of a ministry as it is, we hold fast to the confidence that it is not only just one person manning the ship, it is a collective of us coming together, even in the busyness of life, being able to give glory to the Lord in faithfulness in those moments where, we come in and we're still groggy, waking up, exhausted from what was a busy work week, only to prepare for another work week, but still faithfully doing what the Lord has called us to do and to see how the congregation would respond in a moment. Not because of anything we've done, but everything that Christ is doing in those moments and us being faithful to carry that out. It's been awesome to see, or to be in a church that is fully on board with that mission, because that is the mission itself of this church as well. It's something that's really encouraging. In fact, it's something that I've heard from Ruslan, once again. The structure has to submit to the Spirit, not the other way around. Again, the megachurch model, it's not a bad model, and sometimes it can be so regimented and well-oiled of a machine that it just feels like a routine. It almost just feels too put together, if you will. And it's not to say that there isn't structure at our church, but if we feel led to make changes in real time, we make those changes. If the Spirit speaks to our pastor and he reveals it to us and we confirm what the Spirit has told him, we adjust. And I've really come to appreciate what that looks like, because it's elevated and amplified the giftings of every person that is in ministry there, that not only are they able to adjust, but they themselves are sensitive to the Spirit, that the Lord gives them the provision and the wisdom that they need to adjust accordingly. And I think that's something that's really spoken heavily to us, because as it relates to our marriage, again, breaking down those presuppositions that you can't control every single variable. You're not going to have everything exactly how you want it. But if you are truly after the ways of God and in submission to His will, then there is no better place to be. You will always be in His will when you are after His ways, which means you are immersed in His Word. You are in relationship with Him. And that is something that we've really come to appreciate. And we didn't even really think of it that way. We just faithfully started doing certain things in our day to day that eventually translated to that, to where we're at now. And to be a part of a church that confirms that, not only in us, but also in the mission of the church itself, is something that's really confirmed. Oh Lord, this is what happens when we are faithful, despite the difficulties of some seasons. This is what happens when we truly wait on you with expectancy that you will reveal yourself to us. Because when that time finally came for us to, in some cases, kind of make a decision about where we were going to plant ourselves, the Lord was so good to make it as organic and seamless of a process to get involved at Garden City. And, needless to say, it is home. And it's a church that we both feel at home at. We have community there. We actually get to do life with these people. Our old pastor from Oceanside was so gracious with us because he knew that we were traveling far. And when we were honest with him, and we were honestly afraid to tell him too, just on account of what had happened before with our previous churches, he lovingly reminded us, no, we recognize that you guys are basically doing missions work. It is impossible for you guys to cultivate community with our church in Oceanside because you're 100 miles away, and that's one way, not even going back home. And then you do that every single week. It is not possible to do life with us outside of moving here. And if God hasn't called you here, God hasn't called you here. Why does a bridge have to be burned? And when he said that, I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Like,
You can breathe.
we can breathe a little bit. And again, there was just so much grace there, and it was exactly what I needed personally, just healing from having been failed by previous leaders. And I don't necessarily blame those people. They just function a little bit differently compared to how I would function, and that's okay. And I think if there was anything that I could take away from that season moving forward now, is that all churches, at least that we've been a part of, exist to preach God's word unadulterated and uncompromised. Thankfully, the Lord has given us great discernment on being involved in churches that do exactly that.
Yeah.
But the culture of every church is drastically different. And you have to be okay with reconciling certain things and saying no to others. Meaning that there are some things that maybe you can reconcile with a certain church, but if there are things that are so contrarian to what you need at this point in time for your family, individually, if this is what you do for a living, then you have to be willing to say no. Like, there's no sense of trying to fit it and make it work, because at that point you're not shifting from God's understanding to your own because you want it to work for whatever the reason might be. The Lord's really challenged me in that instance to be less of a dreamer, and to be less ambitious, and to be more discerning and calculated for the sake of my family. Which is why I said what I said earlier about our old church in Los Angeles, that it was a semi-unilateral decision. I'll be more gracious with myself. Because it fed on this desire that I've had for a long time of working full-time, doing music and or ministry in Los Angeles. It's like, and I needed a job at the time, so there wasn't a better opportunity. But we didn't really sit to consider what the culture of the church was, though the community there is amazing. The leadership there is amazing. The people that we have relationships still to this day are all amazing. But the mission of the church was contrary to what the needs of our family was. And for a while, I wasn't willing to reconcile that. But once I saw what it was doing to my family, I realized, I have to be willing to come to terms with this and make the hard decision. But now 2 years later, on the other side of it, it's like, Lord, you are so good to show us what happens when we stick through it and we persevere despite the unknown. In fact, I shared this morning. Psalm 135, verses 3 and 5. Praise the Lord, for he is good. Sing to him. Sing to his name, for it is pleasant. Our Lord is great, and our Lord is above all gods. Something that the Lord spoke to me this morning was there are so many reasons, especially in this particular season, Thanksgiving and Christmas, to be discouraged, to be deflated, to be bitter, to be not thankful, for lack of a better word. But there's also so many reasons to be thankful. Because when you can still praise the Lord despite everything going wrong and unraveling around you, and just everything that, despite your best efforts, it just goes sideways or it doesn't go your way, if you can still praise the Lord in the midst of that, you are probably one of the realest Christians in this modern day and age, because you have every reason to not praise the Lord. And yet in those moments, you know that when you operate in faith, because he is worthy, regardless of circumstance, because he is in control, that worship is blessed. That posture is blessed. And that's something that I had to really learn, especially as somebody that does worship ministry, that it's not a performance. It's not a genre. It is an attitude rooted in my reverence for Christ, my reverence for who God is to me in my life. And that because I have a relationship with him that is growing and continuing to grow by my effort and my best ability, that this reverence of him reinforces over and over again, that the routine stops becoming a routine, that I'm truly being more led by the Spirit. And I believe you would agree in the similar sense that even though it's not exactly what you entailed, at this point in time, there are still ways that the Lord has blessed Miranda even. She mentioned she does sourdough and things like that, that she could still bless other people and be a light to those people, even in seemingly not benign ways, but ways that people wouldn't really consider or think about. And the Lord's just been faithful to show us what that looks like. It's not at all what we thought, but what he's revealed to us has been so much more beautiful than what we could have ever presupposed for ourselves. Mm-hmm. So all that to say, if you're going through ministry burnout, you're not alone. We've been there. Mm-hmm. And by God's grace, we're on the other side of it now. And it doesn't mean we don't have our off days, but we're reminded in those moments that when we're weak, he's strong. In our lowest, he is still there. He sits on the throne and he is our covering. And he has brought us through a lot as far as ministry goes, and has really helped us to reinforce a stronger marriage bed, a stronger home ministry here at home, that our efforts in ministry at our church and with our community have been blessed many times over. And if you guys are going through that process of figuring out what that all looks like, be reassured God is in your midst as you try and figure that stuff out, as you pray to him tirelessly, as you persevere day to day and faithfully do what he's called you to do in the here and now. You guys are not alone. Though we don't have entirely everything figured out, we are comforted knowing that God has certainly shown us exactly where we need to be. And we have confidence in where he has placed us for a time such as this, that not only can we be encouraged as we try to figure out what it means to be new parents and still minister, but also to be an encouragement to you guys who might be trying to figure it out as well.
Yeah, I think the beauty is that we don't have to have everything figured out. I think the longer you are a Christian, you realize you don't have anything figured out. But the beautiful thing is we can trust in God, who doesn't change, who does know everything, and who only has the best for us. And so just keep leaning into him, keep seeking him first, and he will bless whatever season you're in. And so thank you guys for listening, and can't wait to see what God has in store for next week.
Well, and you guys have a blessed Thanksgiving. I know it's coming up. And you guys have a safe holiday season. And we'll see you guys in the next episode. God bless.